Recording is started, so you can go ahead and start the cloud recording.
Good afternoon, everyone, and
Hold
welcome
up.
to.
1 second, let me start the webinar. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We just about to start, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. The topic of the webinar is transition harvest, the economics of green hydrogen use, fertilizer production. My name is Mbeoge. I'm a senior research associate with in the energy program at World Resource Institute. I lead the clean energy transition pillar, and I have key interest in energy planning, renewable energy, green transition, and development economics. I'm a PhD fellow with JUST, and I'm a MSc graduate in energy management here. Transition debates and dialogues have continued to gain interest globally, regionally, and locally. And the various dimensions that have been spoken, green transition, renewable energy transition, transition away from fossil fuel, etc., are interconnected, related, and focused to three key elements of lives or livelihoods. That's economy, society, and environment. To start us off, I'd like to introduce Dr. Meron Tefsau-Mikel. Dr. Meron Tefsau-Mikel is the director of the World Resources Institute Africa Energy Program. He's leading the Institute's efforts in two key areas, energy access and clean energy transition. The energy access pillar seeks to identify sustainable, affordable, and reliable energy solutions to communities that lack access or are facing challenges with inadequate or unreliable power supply. Simultaneously, under the clean energy transition pillar, she supports countries in identifying contextually appropriate transition pathways that are in harmony with climate commitments and development needs. I therefore welcome Dr. Meron to give her opening remarks. Dr. Meron.
Thanks, Imbeo, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion on the economics of green hydrogen use for fertilizer production in Kenya. I am very much delighted that we are coming together to reflect on this important work and also the findings of this research that my colleagues that are going to present have been following very closely. And I think this is also a very important topic, as you will also hear from the discussion, because Kenya already has a very impressive renewable energy foundation where over 80% of the power is generated comes from clean resources, but at the same time, the agriculture sector continues to have, which happens to be also the backbone of the national economy and livelihoods, continue to remain heavily dependent on imported fertilizers, and that dependency exposes farmers to volatile global prices, and also the supply disruption has a major consequence for food security, rural incomes, as well as national resilience. At WRI Africa, we have in the energy program, we have a long record and history of working on the role of energy for equitable development, always with an eye on how energy can unlock opportunities, specifically in the agricultural space, and also in relation to smallholders, as well as food production and food systems. So from powering irrigation to supporting cold storage, our pilots and studies and collaborative interactions with different stakeholders have always consistently focused as well as demonstrated that the transformative role of energy as a development enabler. So those experiences also ground our reflection and conviction that clean energy solutions, which is designed with equity at the center, can drive productivity, resilience, and inclusive growth. So this report is going to show and allow us to discuss some of those key elements and also unpack some of the complexities, as well as the innovations and thinkings that are needed to make green hydrogen as a possibility and potentially replace import fertilizers. So the message of this report and the subsequent conversation is going to be both about the opportunity, the urgency, as well as the way forward in making this happen. I invite you all to engage with this deeply with the report as well as with the discussion to reflect on what it will take for this vision to become a reality. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the subsequent conversations.
Thank you so much, Meron, and thank you for the key highlights that you've observed there. And you've mentioned quite important elements, issues to do with the role of energy for equitable development, need for transition, collaboration, resilience, and inclusive growth. And summarize it all in green hydrogen and its the opportunity that surrounds it here. And really, that makes the foundation of our discourse and dialogue this afternoon. Now, just to remind us that the participants, we are free to engage in chats. Yeah? So the questions, please put them in the chat, lest you forget some question and some important remarks as well. Yeah. So getting into the real subject here. I'll welcome Raj. Raj Sawhney. I hope I spell it correctly. Otherwise, you will help us. So you'll train us how to spell that. Yeah. So Raj is the founder and CEO of Satnam Energy, where he transformed complex energy data into actionable strategies that accelerate clean energy deployment in emerging markets. Raj is also an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His expertise spans energy policy, techno-economic modeling, and transition finance. Previously, a fellow at the Energy Futures Initiative Foundation, Raj helped design the Hydrogen Demand Initiative in the Department of Energy, Department of Energy funded program creating demand-side support mechanism for clean hydrogen offtake. At Satnam Energy, he provides energy policy analysis, capacity expansion modeling, and project finance support to governments, multilaterals, and investors across Africa, South Asia, Latin America, with recent engagement in India, Kenya, Brazil, and Europe. Raj also chairs the Africa Hydrogen Partnership Modeling Team, developing infrastructure priorities and cost pathways for hydrogen deployment across the continent. He holds BSc in Mathematics and Computer Science from Harvard College and an MSc in Computational and Applied Mathematics from Claremont Graduate University. Welcome, Raj, and let's continue engaging in the chat.
Thank you for the introduction, Mbeo. My name is Raj Sawhney, and as he said, I'm the CEO of Satnam Energy. Satnam Energy is an energy consultancy focused on accelerating an equitable, sustainable global energy transition. As Mbeo mentioned, today I'll be taking you through the results of our work with the World Resources Institute on the potential for green hydrogen and fertilizers in Kenya. I'd quickly like to give a quick shout out to the co-authors of this paper, Benson Ireri and Sebastian Sturl. I think Sebastian's with us in the chat as well. So with that, let's get into it. To begin, I'll summarize the presentation structure. We'll start by quickly reviewing the definitions of green hydrogen and derivatives, then we'll provide an overview of the relevant aspects of Kenya's fertilizer market. After that, we'll dive into the meat of our technical and economic analysis on green hydrogen and derivatives and discuss other non-cost barriers to adoption. Finally, we'll conclude and discuss key pathways forward. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, to begin, what is green hydrogen and its derivatives? Green hydrogen, as most of you know, is hydrogen produced using purely renewable energy resources, where renewable energy powers an electrolyzer, and electricity splits a water molecule into its constituent hydrogen and oxygen molecules. This process is emissions-free so long as the input electricity is also emissions-free. Green hydrogen derivatives are products derived directly from green hydrogen, And for the scope of today's report, we'll include green ammonia and green fertilizer. Without further ado, we can jump into the Kenyan fertilizer market context now. Next slide, please. So as you all know, and as Maron mentioned, agriculture is the backbone of Kenya's economy. It supports 33% of Kenya's GDP and employs 40% of Kenya's total population, including 70% of its rural population. And as you can see in the chart on the right, nitrogenous fertilizers make up the majority of Kenya's fertilizer consumption. Kenya is entirely dependent on fertilizer imports, with DAP being the largest single import, assuming that we take different blends of NPK aside. Next slide, please. Because nitrogenous fertilizer plays such a large role within the agricultural sector, green fertilizer production is a cornerstone piece of Kenya's pathway towards a green hydrogen industry. Nitrogenous fertilizers such as DAP depend on ammonia production, which in turn requires hydrogen as a critical feedstock. Since fertilizer manufacturing processes are well established and highly optimized, the industry represents an ideal off-taker for green hydrogen. The combination of hydrogen's essential role in production and the mature, well-understood nature of these processes minimizes technical risks while creating reliable, long-term demand for green hydrogen. As a result, green fertilizer is a key piece of Kenya's national hydrogen strategy. Next slide, please. Domestic green fertilizer production is Kenya's preferred pathway to market development. As you can see on the graphic on your screen, Kenya aims to replace 20% of its imported nitrogen fertilizer by 2027 and 50% by 2030, representing nearly 300 to 400,000 tons of annual production. This domestic fertilizer production infrastructure is expected to serve as a foundation for developing other green hydrogen applications, such as sustainable aviation fuels and shipping fuels. To understand the opportunities and barriers facing green hydrogen adoption, we will now dive into the techno-economic analysis, which is the meat of the report. Excuse me. Let me quickly walk you through our calculation methodology using this flowchart. We start with three key inputs: renewable energy data, covering 15 years of hourly wind and solar capacity factors, capital and operating costs for renewables and electrolyzers, and various financial parameters like the cost of capital. All of this feeds into our optimization protocol, which finds the lowest possible hydrogen cost for each location by optimizing renewable energy capacity against electrolyzer size. For a more complete description of our methodology, all key technical and financial parameters and limitations, please refer to the full report. Now, let's look at what this methodology reveals when we apply it to Kenya. As you can see from this heat map on the right, green hydrogen costs vary widely across Kenya. The lighter blue areas represent the most cost-effective regions, while the darker areas show where production would be more expensive. These cost differences are driven primarily by differences in wind and solar capacity factors across the country. Areas with consistently strong winds or abundant solar radiation can produce hydrogen much more cheaply than regions with less favorable renewable resources. Looking at the numbers, current green hydrogen production costs in Kenya range from $2.80 per kilogram in the best locations up to $7 in less favorable areas. The mean cost across the country is $5.44 per kilogram, with a median of $6.10. It's important to note that these costs are 3 to 4 times higher than current gray and blue hydrogen production. For the remainder of this analysis, we will analyze and break down the components of this production cost for the median location in Kenya. Next slide, please. Now, the chart here shows the breakdown of the levelized cost of hydrogen production at the median cost location. There are 3 sets of bars. Each set represents different assumptions regarding electrolyzer costs. We start with current electrolyzer costs and use IEA 2030 and 2050 cost reductions in the last 2 sets. Then, within each set of 3 bars, we vary the cost of capital to understand its effect on overall levelized cost. Within each set, we compute the LCOH at 8.4, 15, and 20% cost of capital. Now, going into the first set of bars, current costs, the yellow here represents solar capex costs, like the cost of panels. The orange represents the additional dollar per kilogram cost imposed by the cost of capital. The light orange pinkish color represents electrolyzer capex, and the dark red represents the associated cost of capital. Because we are modeling purely behind the meter production facilities, the operating costs represent significantly less than they would in a grid-connected facility. Now, looking at current costs, we notice that green hydrogen costs are not economic in the short or medium terms. Even at an extremely conservative 8%, the cost of capital adds more than $2 to the overall levelized cost. At 15%, it adds nearly $4.50 and accounts for over half of the total cost. The same is true in the 20% case. Then, as we move to the 2030 and 2050 cost sets, we see that even as electrolyzer costs fall, the levelized cost of hydrogen does not fall below the $5.60 in 2030 and $3.90 in 2050. In these cost sets, the cost of capital has the same effect, drastically increasing project costs. Even at $3.90, green hydrogen costs would still be nearly twice as expensive as its gray counterpart. Green hydrogen projects, especially behind the meter, are capex intensive, meaning that the majority of investment must happen upfront. The larger this initial investment cost, the larger the effect the cost of capital has on the levelized cost. This problem is exacerbated by Kenya's high cost of capital, which is driven by political, currency, and other forms of country-specific risk. Projects will need to utilize creative forms of financing, like currency hedges, in order to mitigate these challenges. Now, the conclusion from this graphic is clear. Although reductions in cost of capital and electrolyzer costs are necessary, they are not sufficient to reach cost parity. This means that projects must look for both demand and supply side help. Again, it is unlikely that green hydrogen production costs will be able to fall low enough, fast enough, to achieve cost parity in any realistic time frame. As a result, projects must look to both boost the demand side by searching for higher paying offtake and bring down production costs through concessional financing. Next slide, please. As you might expect, green hydrogen production costs drive high green ammonia costs. If we take a green hydrogen cost of $6.10, as we showed on the previous slide, and then use that to compare the levelized cost of ammonia from new build green versus gray production facilities, we see that green ammonia is more than twice as expensive as gray. Although green ammonia achieves some cost savings by not needing a steam methane reformer, the cost difference between gray and green hydrogen feedstock quickly eats this up. You can see this in green. To put this into context, you need a break-even carbon price of $2.80 per kilogram, ridiculously high, to achieve cost parity. However, let's see how these numbers fare over the long term. Next slide, please. Now, the chart above takes the three hydrogen cost sets and sensitivities I showed before and computes the cost of green ammonia at each hydrogen price. In pink, we have the average levelized cost of hydrogen. The green represents the levelized cost of ammonia. The green represents the pessimistic levelized cost of ammonia, and the blue represents the optimistic levelized cost of ammonia. The range surrounding each color represents the sensitivity cost analysis from varying electrolyzer prices. The graph below shows that we estimate current green ammonia costs in Kenya to be between $1,400 and $2,500, a 4 to 8x premium over current gray ammonia prices. Even in the long term, under the most optimistic assumptions, production costs just barely drop below $1,000. Now, to achieve cost parity, green hydrogen prices will need to fall drastically, which, as we discussed, will likely be driven by a reduction in capital costs as well as decreased expenses for electrolyzers and renewable energy infrastructure. Even still, without domestic policies, foreign mandates, or concessional financing, the existing cost premium associated with green ammonia will likely need to be passed on to the end consumer, fertilizer distributors, and farmers. This is an unsustainable solution for a highly price-sensitive sector, which we'll discuss in more detail later. For now, if we take green ammonia costs and we estimate that these costs translate to domestic green DAP production costs of around $990 per ton, 40% more expensive than current imports of $700 per ton. However, in order to properly compare the difference between domestic green fertilizer against imported gray fertilizer, we need to account for the other non-production costs associated with imported fertilizer. To do so, we'll break down Russian DAP import costs and analyze where domestic production actually saves money. Let's move to the next slide. Again, the waterfall chart here shows the cost breakdown of Russian imported DAP. It includes cost categories like freight, marine insurance, and financing. Now, obviously, domestic fertilizer production avoids a number of these costs. By producing domestically, there is no marine insurance, freight, or clearing costs. When we account for these cost savings, we see that instead of the 40% cost gap from imports, we have an approximately 20% cost gap, $840 per ton for green domestic DAP versus $700 per ton for imported DAP. This represents a 20% price hike, a clear improvement over the 40% gap seen earlier. Unfortunately, this remaining cost increase, if introduced into the market, could have measurable effects further downstream on both farmers and crop production rates. Let's move to the next slide. Using the numbers we presented above, we find that if farmers switch to buying green fertilizer at a 20% higher price point, fertilizer application rates could drop by 10.4%. This would move Kenya even further away from its goal of increasing fertilizer use. Next slide, please. Then, as fertilizer application rates drop, we estimate that crop production rates would drop by 7.6%, potentially worsening the food security crisis. Now, in order to avoid these impacts, project developers, financiers, and policymakers will have to carefully and creatively develop innovative financing and subsidy solutions. Before diving into our recommended pathways forward, we will first discuss the non-cost barriers to adoption. Next slide, please. Now, the diagram here shows Kenya's current fertilizer distribution system, which presents structural challenges for introducing green fertilizers. At the top, we have 680,000 tons of imported fertilizer flowing through several channels. The largest portion, 38%, goes through hub agro-dealers, who distribute to retail dealers and ultimately to farmers. Then, 28% flows through the National Cereals and Produce Board, which offers subsidized fertilizer at reduced prices, dropping costs from $50 to $19 per bag. While this is beneficial to low-income farmers, it has mixed market effects. The NCPB subsidy scheme essentially competes with private dealers, and every kilogram of subsidized fertilizer displaces about 0.2 kilograms of commercial sales. The NCPB also distributes subsidized fertilizers at specific depots, requiring farmers to wait in long lines at limited NCPB locations, often for hours or days, incurring significant transportation costs and time delays. The system also suffers from supply shortages. The NCPB recently fell 225,000 tons short of its target, and approximately 40% of subsidized fertilizer leaks to unintended recipients who sell it at higher prices. Now, introducing expensive green fertilizers into this system could exacerbate these inefficiencies. If distributed through the NCPB, green fertilizers would crowd out even more private sales and require larger subsidies to be affordable. The higher costs would mean smaller subsidized volumes, worsening existing shortages. And with 40% leakage, much of the green fertilizer may not even reach the intended small-scale farmers. Next slide, please. Another non-cost barrier, and I'll run through this one quickly to pick up some time, is the lack of existing technical expertise. The global green hydrogen market is nascent, with new electrolyzer technologies coming out frequently. As a result, best practices surrounding maintenance and safety have yet to be established. Thus, the lack of local and global technical knowledge and workforce required to implement large-scale green hydrogen projects is a barrier to project development. Let's move on. Now, to jump to our conclusion and pathways forward. This diagram here shows that developing a successful green fertilizer industry in Kenya requires coordinated policy interventions across the entire value chain, from production incentives on the left to end consumer support on the right. Let me highlight the 5 critical insights from our analysis marked by the numbered circles. First, the high cost of capital and plant capex make green hydrogen economically unviable without significant intervention. We need both production incentives and end consumers willing to pay premium prices. Second, targeted financial support, including concessional financing and currency hedges, could catalyze private investment. The key is reducing the financing burden that dominates total costs. Third, supply side incentives alone cannot close the cost gap. Kenya must also access higher value revenue streams, potentially through international markets and carbon credit mechanisms. Fourth, these international and carbon markets represent the most promising pathways towards economic viability, but they require sophisticated market development and international partnerships. Programs like H2 Global's double-sided auctions could play a key role here. Finally, we cannot ignore the equity implications. If green fertilizer policies drive up overall fertilizer prices, they could exacerbate food security challenges for the very farmers they're meant to help. So, to conclude, if Kenya is to pursue green hydrogen production, it must do more than just wait for technologies to move down the cost curve. It requires a comprehensive policy framework that addresses financing costs, develops international revenue streams, and carefully manages the transition to avoid harming food security and equity. The question for policymakers is whether Kenya is ready to make these coordinated long-term investments. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Raj, and thank you for bringing that out very clearly. And I pick out quite interesting point. It's true that Kenya has very high ambition in terms of green hydrogen, but the question of green and gray and the cost aspect really puts it in a limbo. Yeah, and you really mentioned quite interesting point that this cost aspect, even in 2050, we are still not be able to compete with the conventional ones here. I think there's quite a lot that the government probably will need to do. Now, we'll have perspectives from two speakers. And to start us off, I'll introduce I'll introduce Meron Tesfaye. Meron Tesfaye is a senior policy analyst at the Energy for Growth Hub. And before joining, she worked as a senior policy analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center, focusing on various aspects of U.S. clean energy policy, including clean hydrogen, industrial decarbonization, biomass, clean fuels, carbon management, and environmental justice. Previously, Meron was a senior policy fellow at the Carbon 180, Developing Equitable Federal Policies for Carbon Removal and Climate Mitigation Technologies. She also serves as social fellow in California Senate Budget. I therefore want to welcome Meron to first provide us with some of her reflections. Welcome, Meron.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and offer some thoughts. And really appreciate also Raj kind of setting that scene really well and highlighting the key takeaways. Some things I'm going to highlight are of similar kind of takeaway from what Raj already stated, but we at the Energy for Growth have been tracking the hydrogen and Africa landscape for over the last year and a half, maybe even almost 2 years. And let me tell you a little bit about the current status of projects. So currently, not considering infrastructure and pilot projects, there are technically about close to 90 projects in Africa, in different parts of Africa. They span over 17 countries, and most of them, about 47 of them, target ammonia as the final end product. And majority of that is actually targeting export markets. Now, I know this webinar is focused on localizing production, but I think the export conversation is also very important in kind of thinking about how we actually commercialize and scale up hydrogen production. And it plays a big role in Africa because we don't have local demand yet and we have that green premium that Raj mentioned. So basically, if we were to assume that that these ammonia projects are going to be are going to proceed forward, we're going to need a lot of large scale projects. That's the current landscape. There's a lot of large scale proposed projects, a lot of export focused projects in Africa right now. And but few of them, majority of them don't have any financing or takers. So it's kind of a lot of plan and hopes for a market that just doesn't exist yet, unfortunately. So along those, that's sort of the status of the continent as a whole. And in that setting, there's sort of 4 points I kind of want to make. A lot of the push for green hydrogen and green ammonia right now is really holding on to embedded assumptions about what we think the clean hydrogen landscape is in Africa. So there's the assumption that that there's low cost electricity, and that because of Africa's very high quality solar and wind potential, that that hydrogen production will actually be cheaper. And the target number that we keep hearing is $1 per kilogram. Producing hydrogen for $1 per kilogram will get us there. So $1 per kilogram translates to less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. And right now, both solar and wind are wind is about 5 cents, and solar at the utility scale is about 7 cents. So even at the current sort of macro level standpoint, it's really, really hard to bring down that cost curve. Now, Africa has produced ammonia before, and it has done it at low cost, but that was when we had abundant hydro at about 3 cents. So, so we no longer live in that reality. The second thing I want to say, and I know I'm taking some time, but the second thing I want to say is there's assumption that because of this high quality renewable, that deployment is going to be fast. But as Raj said, it requires a lot of energy to produce hydrogen, and it requires a lot of electrolyzer to actually make all this hydrogen. And so deploying that actually takes a lot of time. And currently, Africa faces like high capital costs, currency challenges, and financing challenges that really stall deployment. Third thing I want to make, and this is where the sort of local production connects to export market, is demand, demand, demand. So demand is going to be really critical because production of ammonia right now is very expensive, and to sell it, we're going to have to start with export market. That's why a lot of these projects are targeting the export market. But even in that scenario, the off-takers, majority of the off-takers are Europeans, and Europeans have recently scaled down how much they will export into their markets. They've also been doing their own analysis to show that it might be cheaper to actually produce hydrogen elsewhere, and actually getting it from from a lot of parts in Africa will not be competitive. So this is recent analysis that we've seen, and this challenge is really playing out globally. We're not seeing projects get to financial investment decisions. We've only seen last year only 6% of proposed projects actually had identified a buyer for their hydrogen. So this shows us that the demand is not there yet, and that's going to be a big gap. The last and final one I want to say, because especially emerging markets are going to need public financing. Currently, there's a lot of the last few years, a lot of European partners have made a lot of commitments to actually bring in that public financing. They want to support export because they want to import hydrogen, but this has not been reality. In reality, only a small amount of that promised funding has actually landed in hydrogen projects. So that means most of the proposed projects that I told you about at the beginning may not necessarily make the cut or may not necessarily be financially sound. So I say all of that to say for Africa to be a notable player in hydrogen, uh, energy and affordability of energy is going to be a huge task, and that's across the board. So without tackling that solution, there's really no future for specifically green hydrogen. Um, and African projects will have to right size their ambitions to really reflect that. And African countries are going to have to invest in their energy infrastructure, local demand, and industrialization if we at the future want to have hydrogen play a role. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Meron. And the last statement really sounds so strong. The future of hydrogen in Africa. I'll come back to that during the Q&A, and therefore I request and I remind us that let's continue engaging in the chat. Put your questions, put your comments in the chat, and we'll come back to it here. So I'll invite Sishi to provide the second perspective in this discussion here. Sisi is Sisi is a researcher with over 8 years of experience at the intersection of energy, climate, and development. Her work focuses on how industrial policies, energy systems, and the supply chain can drive inclusive and sustainable economic growth in Africa. She has worked with governments, multilateral institutions, and civil society across the globe and bring both US and Chinese perspective to her analysis. Welcome, Sisi, and let's engage in the chat.
Thank you, Mbeo, and thank you, WRI, for inviting me to this webinar, and thank you, Raj and Maren, for sharing your perspective. As Mbeo mentioned, my background is in power system planning, industrial policy, and technology adoption. So, and because Raj and Maren had brought up very good points about the entire value chain, I will focus my comments specifically on green hydrogen, especially because in the entire value chain, green hydrogen is really the new technology here that has the highest risks and costs. So my first point will focus on the cost barrier of green hydrogen. And as Raj had mentioned, a lot of the high cost for green hydrogen comes from electricity. And Raj's paper talks about the context and gives useful suggestions for standalone projects. And I have done actually a complementary study that looks at grid connected green hydrogen. So specifically, I'm looking at what happens if we connect electrolyzers to the electricity grid. And my study actually shows that when you connect the electrolyzer to the grid, because an electrolyzer is a flexible load, meaning that you can operate it whenever you would like, it actually allows higher wind penetration across the entire electricity system. And since we're building new wind power, which is much cheaper than the current geothermal to fulfill the growing electricity demand in Kenya, it actually decreases system-wise electricity costs. So not just for green hydrogen projects, but for the entire country. And the as we bring more wind online to Kenya's power grid, the grid-connected green hydrogen can also meet major emission intensity standards internationally, including the standards put out by EU and the Green Hydrogen Organization. And it also meets other certification standards such as geographical and temporal co-location. And the geographical location of these new even grid-connected electrolyzers as well as wind projects are actually consistent with what Raj's paper has shown. And on top of that, so that has shown that we already decrease electricity cost. But on top of that, because the general cost saving happens across the entire country's electricity grid, this cost saving can be translated into a better time of use tariff for green hydrogen electrolyzers. And it further lowers electricity costs for green hydrogen, which addresses the key cost challenge that Raj had mentioned for the entire green hydrogen and green ammonia and green fertilizer industry. And this is an interesting point to consider because this electricity-wise cost reduction not only benefits the green hydrogen industry, but it benefits Kenya's entire economy because Kenya's high electricity cost has been a barrier for development in general. So this is really thinking from a perspective of industrial policy. We're not only making this green hydrogen industry work, but we're making sure it benefits the entire country and the entire economy. And in other words, we're making sure that we want to make sure that green hydrogen not only works in Kenya, but it works for Kenya. But of course, to achieve this, similar to Raj's recommendation, to achieve this benefit, we really need coordination between both the green hydrogen industry as well as the power sector. We need the wind projects to be built around the same time as new electrolyzers, and we also need better pricing mechanisms so that the electrolyzers can be paid for the flexibility and reliability service that it provides to the grid that benefits the entire country. So that's on the cost front. And then another barrier I want to talk about is the technological risk around a very new technology, which is green hydrogen. This is a very real risk. Globally, the only reason why people consider green hydrogen to be ready for adoption and ready for a tipping point is because there has been a very large and stable fertilizer industry, which means that this market is able to take on some of the early stage, higher cost, more expensive green hydrogen. And then later on, there's also a big enough base to absorb new capacity brought online. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Kenya or in most African countries, as Marin and Raj have both mentioned. There hasn't been enough fertilizer production domestically that can directly take on the green hydrogen that's being produced. So it is so in other words, to build such an industry, you're building every point of the entire value chain all at once, and that can be very risky. Now, to strategically think about when we want to adopt these new technologies, we can think of being a first mover or a second mover. So a first mover means you're adopting the technology before everybody else. And the benefits is that you can occupy the market share very early. You can also occupy a lot of the IPs in place, but it comes at a very high cost since the risk is higher. Meanwhile, the second mover means that you will adopt the technology once the market and the technology is more mature. And there are actually a lot of benefits from that, from being a second mover as well, because there's a spillover effect from the first movers reducing the cost of technology and building a robust market. Um, and so to think about whether Kenya wants to be a first mover of green hydrogen or a second mover, we can actually think about two different markets. Globally, Kenya and African countries should be very cautious about adopting such a new technology at an early stage, meaning being a first mover. We also want to think about whether African countries need to bear the risk of these technological risks. Um, and meanwhile, as a second mover, actually, Kenya would benefit from all the technological and market spillovers as the technology matures more globally. On the other hand, if we think about a regional market, which means for Kenya, it means maybe the East African market. In this market, Kenya actually can be a first mover. So as the global market matures, maybe in 5 or 10 years later, technology has become more stable. Most likely within Africa and within East Africa, there hasn't been already a robust green hydrogen industry. This is when Kenya can come in and be be a global second mover and a regional first mover. Before that, Kenya could have already established fertilizer production domestically to take on green hydrogen, or it has been able to work on its electricity system to significantly reduce the electricity cost. This is when Kenya can become a regional first mover and start green hydrogen, ammonia, and fertilizer production regionally. So This also, of course, requires a lot of coordination and requires a lot of planning in advance. And this aligns with sort of the first point I have mentioned, talking about how do you reduce electricity cost across the system. So yeah, my two comments is that number one, Kenya can think about grid connected green hydrogen as a way to reduce cost. And second, Kenya can consider being a global second mover and a regional first mover for the green hydrogen and derivative market. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Shishe, for that contribution and those perspective. Yeah. And when you're talking about technologies, it brings to mind of the abundance of renewable energy in within the content, and it ties very closely to what Meron talked about in terms of the availability of these renewable energy resources. And before I get into question, but several things were lingering on my mind. Most countries are becoming, the demand is much lower than the supply. Ethiopia in the next 5 years will be having like 10 gigawatts. Its demand is less than half that. In Kenya, we talk of supply demand gaps here, and we still have untapped resources in the African context here. What's the opportunity of taking action on or curtailing these supplies? These are some of the things that will come into perspective as we continue in the discussion here. So it's another good time that we want now to have a wide engagement with the rest of the participants entering into the Q&A, question and answer. Let me see if there are some questions that are already coming up through the chats, or you can just raise up your hands and then we can pick it here. Let me see. There's one question from Alemayehu. Are the comparison of the levelized cost of gray and green ammonia the same in the report, figure 4, page 11, and the presentation? I think that goes to Raj.
Yeah, happy to take that, Mbeo. Yes, they are the same. The color coding is a little bit different, and the slide you see in the graphic you see in the presentation isn't as well designed, but they are the same. And you can find all of the graph in sort of table form in the appendix. The appendix also contains all of the technical and financial parameters that went into the green and gray ammonia analysis.
Okay, great. Thank you for that response here. As other questions continue to come, please don't feel shy in raising up your hand. There's another question. It seems the comparison, again from LMIU, it seems the comparison of levelized cost of gray and green ammonia is reversed, and the presentation compared to the report. Yeah, so I think maybe that's still the same follow-up of the initial question. And uh, I can see Sebastian still says that I agree with LMIU. Maybe, I don't know if you want to again further react to it, or
Sure. Yeah,
come
yeah,
from,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll definitely take a look at the graphic in the report. I think if anything, maybe there may be a mislabeling um, of the graph, the report, but the numbers should be the same, right? Gray ammonia is about half the price of green ammonia, and all of that is driven by sort of green hydrogen cost. I think that's sort of the key takeaway there, but appreciate the notification, and we'll make sure to check that.
Okay. There is another question by Felix Otieno. Felix Otieno says that my concern is all about intake. The Kenyan grades still can't accommodate high energy intake, including the Kenyan interest in the nuclear plant, which should be of concern. Is it on source or grid capacity intake? I think that's quite complex. Maybe I'll request Felix Otieno to speak up and maybe make the question more clear. Felix, are you able to speak?
It's the question about additional generation integration into the grid.
Yeah, I probably think so. Yeah.
Is
As
it maybe is it maybe asking about demand stimulation? Maybe is it asking about like if Kenya is adding more capacity, there isn't enough demand to use the capacity, or is it what vice versa?
Yeah, in my interpretation, I think it's about the demand to the capacity because already we having some aspect of uh, high capacity than demand. Yeah, so need for demand stimulation, and already the country also still having interest and discussion about the introducing nuclear power plants. Yeah, so the rapid growth of demand. Kind of scenario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I can speak a bit on the demand stimulation side of things. I think I think Raj's paper looks at standalone projects, which means that the green hydrogen projects actually do not interact with the electricity grid at all, so it wouldn't affect whether the demand or supply is affected. My research actually does look at what happens when you connect the electrolyzers to the grid. I think right now the issue of demand and supply is really about curtailment when electricity is not at its peak. I believe the electricity grid right now is trying to meet peak demand by geothermal, which is it's a base load, which means it can produce at all times. Um, Oh, it seems like great capacity. Um, if you bring in green hydrogen onto the grid, it could be as big and as little as you like. It depends on how big the electrolyzer project is. And the benefit is that it's very flexible. So you can perhaps avoid peak hours when the electricity supply should be used to meet the domestic demand. While when nobody's using electricity, maybe geothermal or other electricity is being wasted, being curtailed, you can use green hydrogen to take on this opportunity. And of course, at the same time, because green hydrogen can provide this type of flexibility, it can be compensated with a better time of use tariff.
Yeah, I think I want to echo what Shishi's saying and agree that it's possible to use green hydrogen flexibly as both as energy storage and produce other derived products from it. I think that happens in a very optimal scenario and also when electrolyzer cost goes down because at current cost and at current electrolyzer performance specs, it's really hard to have your electrolyzer not performing because you'll be losing a lot of money as a developer. It's just not attractive. And two, electrolyzers are yet to be best optimized for that on and off fluctuation of hydrogen production.
And I'll just quickly echo that sentiment. I think Moran and Chishi hit that. I agree with that completely. I think the real question is as Moran mentioned, who is going to buy the electrolyzer and run it? Because in almost every scenario, especially given the sort of Kenyan electricity grid, anybody running that electrolyzer is likely going to lose money if green hydrogen is the off-taker. And so, if you can get someone to do it, there is value there for the grid as a whole, but they would need to be compensated in other ways.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a quite an interesting perspective because, okay, there's other perspective of the infrastructure capacity and stability of grid. And as you put it, Sheshe, electrolyzer works in both ways, energy storage, also uh, producing the hydrogen for other uses here, and needing to optimize and continually use. And you always want to have this running. Yeah. Now, I just have one question here. From the presentation, green hydrogen technology is quite a niche and it's nascent. Yeah. And the development of these technologies will not will sometimes take long time, and it needs government protection, it needs nurturing, it needs innovators and other actors to come into play. Yeah. What do you think will be the role of government in supporting private investor, in supporting these actors and agencies who would want to invest in this? Yeah, the solars, the winds we are talking about today, 20, 30, or 40 years, there were also nascent technologies. And that's now what we can classify green hydrogen as a nascent technology today. In future, this transformation will transform or will develop depending on this innovation hub or laboratory that the innovators will be exposed to in the environment, the ecosystem of development. What do you think will be the role of government in bringing this together?
I'm happy to quickly take a stab at that. I think I really think the focus, from the government side should be more about um, investing in the end use for what green hydrogen can solve, right? So it's not so much about trying to build a green hydrogen industry rather than it is, trying to fix the fertilizer issue. And maybe green hydrogen is the solution there, and maybe it's not. Similarly, if you want to think about green hydrogen for sort of energy, right? Maybe the solution is instead of investing in green hydrogen, it's investing in the grid, right? Expanding capacity, making the grid more reliable, etc. And by doing these things, you sort of can potentially incentivize green hydrogen, but you more directly solve the problem at hand, right? And so instead of sort of pouring all of this money trying to nurture this technology, I think maybe that money is better suited trying to solve the existing issues we have.
Yeah, I think it has to be, I agree, it has to be a question about what does Kenya want as a like an economic solution, as a growth solution, and where does potentially hydrogen fit into that? And maybe it doesn't. And that's the key question for governments because technology sort of comes and goes. So depending on who you ask, hydrogen has been nascent for 30 to 50 years and it kind of ebbs and flows. The enthusiasm we have for it ebbs and flows. And so we have to we need governments to make decisions about how to balance near-term gains and short-term kind of growth aspirations. So even in the question that you kind of brought up, Beo, earlier about Ethiopia having a lot of supply and not enough demand, that is going to be up to governments to choose which industries to dedicate that supply to, and I think it's best for governments to choose demand centers that can have better spillover effects, better economic returns, and better jobs.
And maybe I'll just add one more point to highlight the importance of coordination within the government. When we talk about government, it's easy to think of it as one entity, but in practice, government is made up with a lot of people and different agencies. And what happens very often is that one agency is tasked with one mission. So their priority is only about this one particular thing. But as we have seen in the issue with green hydrogen, green ammonia, and green fertilizer, it's an entire value chain intersecting with different sectors of the country. You have to think about how the power system sector and the agriculture sector and the industry sector, how do they really align and coordinate with each other to achieve all of these potential benefits that the green hydrogen and derivative industry can achieve? And I think that's highlighted in Roger's report and Maren's comments and in my own research as well.
Okay, thank you. We have 1 minute, and there's just one more question, which maybe I'll request Raj to respond to. Then we'll be closing here. There was a comparison of cost of DAP, but I was wondering whether there was a consideration of using ammonia and lime or other locally available material to produce fertilizer. Just in 30 seconds.
Sure. So there isn't in the brief, However, we have done some more detailed cost modeling looking at anhydrous ammonia and the potential for sort of distributed small scale fertilizer systems using anhydrous ammonia. If that's of interest, happy to follow up offline.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for joining this webinar. And I acknowledge the contribution, the perspective from Meron, the perspective from Sishi, and the wonderful work that Raj and the team have done. And I think this just a signal that there is quite a long way that Kenya has to go. And I don't know whether to say that they'll have to try to manage the ambition at this moment, but I think it's too early to do that here. But with all this recommendation, we'll take a desirable pathway for effective and for sustainable development growth for our country. Thank you, and let's continue having this discussion either bilaterally as organizations and collaboratively.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.